Welcome, everyone, to today's Adventure Box podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the battles of Quebec and Montreal, and then we're going to go down to New York. This is actually a very important time. This week is talking about very important battles that happened at the very beginning. First off, I'm going to tell you about what's really interesting to me about this campaign, the one to Montreal and Quebec. How many times have those two cities, those two areas been attacked, whether it was by the British, the colonists? It doesn't just end with the American Revolution. They're actually attacked later on. And this actually creates the boundaries between Canada and the United States. So why do we need to learn about this? Well, why is there a border between Canada and the United States? How did they become basically two separate countries? Here's another one that's interesting. I was reading something else, a diary, a journal. And in this journal, it talked about how they lived in, what was it called? And I can't remember the actual city, but it said Ontario. Well, I knew that it was in the New York area. And I was like, Ontario, what are you talking about? Oh, yeah, that's right. Ontario, or at least New York, used to be part of Ontario, Canada. Where did that line get crossed? Where did that actually solidify to becoming what it is today? You're actually going to learn about that next month. But, I think 3 months from now, when we talk about the War of 1812. But as of right now, let's talk about something that's very important, and that's the battles of Montreal and Quebec. Okay, do you remember the person by the name of Benedict Arnold? I'll remind you of something that I just talked about last week with him. Benedict Arnold is the one that took over Fort Ticonderoga. So that is Fort Ticonderoga. That is in the Vermont area. It's actually on the borders, I think, of Vermont and New York. This was a very important fort because it was a British fort. Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen were able to go up into Fort Ticonderoga with the Mountain Boys, the Green Mountain Boys, and take this fort without a shot being fired. That's right. During the dead of night, they snuck into the fort and took it over without shooting one bullet. That is pretty impressive. Okay, so what else happened that makes this so important? Well, the United States, the Continental Congress, didn't really have any large cannons. So this was the place that they were going to take over so they could bring the British cannons back to Boston in order to fight in the siege of Boston. So we're going a little bit back. Okay, so rewind just a little bit. So Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold come up to Fort Ticonderoga and capture their cannons. Now, they don't actually transport it until the next year, until 1776. But 1775, they take it over. 1775, it didn't end there. The year did not end there. I think it was like midsummer. So after they did that, they got orders. Benedict Arnold and Montgomery, two different commanding officers. One was supposed to go through Lake Champlain, in the Great Lakes. Let's see. Here we go. So this is Fort Ticonderoga. Scoot out. Here's New York. Here's Vermont. It's right here. Now, Montgomery, he went up the river into Montgomery. So this is the lake I'm talking about. Lake Champlain. I mean, that's how I would say it, but I think it's French, so Champlain. Champagne? Lake Champlain. That actually might be a Champlain. Okay. But they then crossed over. They went up the river and came into Quebec. So Montgomery took his troops, came in, and took over Quebec. It was a little fight. It wasn't that big of a skirmish as much as the other one. But for Montreal, they went in and they took over a fort, which was Fort Saint Jean. Actually, I'm going to type that in so we can see. So if you're not seeing the YouTube channel, you're going to just hear what I'm doing. But I'm typing into Google Maps, Fort Saint Jean. Where is that exactly? There it is. Where's the actual fort? Somewhere in that area. And most likely it's not there anymore. I'm not 100% sure where it would be. Okay, but that's where it was. So they came up through Lake Champlain, came up, or Chaplin, came up to Fort Saint Jean and took that fort over. Then they continued northward without the British having the ability to get communications up to Montreal saying, hey, the colonists are coming. Then Montgomery was able to come up and over, so it wasn't much of a track, and come over the river to take over Montreal. So that was a lot of fighting. That was a lot of conquest in just a little bit of time. That was September of 1775. So that was right after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and that's while they're still working on Boston. But the Continental Army was driven at making as many fast wins as possible. So they come up and they take over Fort Saint Jean and also Montreal. Now, that all happened by November. So September, October, November. It took a little bit of time, but of course it would because they're marching up. They had to take one fort and then keep going up and take Montreal. Benedict Arnold had a different approach. His was actually to go after Quebec. So while Fort Montgomery was coming up the river and into Montreal, taking Montreal, we then have Benedict Arnold, who goes up through Maine. Now, he actually started off in, let's see, I think he departed Cambridge. Let's find out where Cambridge is on the map. Cambridge. It's Massachusetts, but Cambridge. Come on. No, not Cambridge, England. Cambridge. Massachusetts? There we go. Yeah, take me way over there. Okay. So just outside of Boston. So Benedict Arnold had actually come back after taking Fort Ticonderoga, came back down to Boston, delivered the cannons, if I remember correctly. I think it was either 1775 or 1776. It's not that important. But then he was able to come back up through Maine. So he had a long distance to hike. And up to Quebec City. Now, during this time, you have Montgomery, who just took over Montreal, to make his way up to Quebec City as well. So this is where the colonists are about to try to take over most of most of Canada. Everything that the British owned in Canada, the big forts. Now, this was a big deal. If they could take over Canada, I mean, that would be a big problem for Great Britain. Well, come to find out, they actually get there around, November 13th, 1775 is when Arnold arrives, and then joins forces with him just after that with Montgomery. And while doing that, they put together this plan. Now, it takes them like half a month to get this plan together in order to attack Quebec City. So they laid siege on December 8th, 1775. Now, let me ask you, what is the weather like in December, around the 8th of December? It's pretty cold, right? It's dropping in temperature, especially up in northern Maine and lower Canada. So you have not so well-trained soldiers marching with two competent officials, actually very competent when it comes to both of them, but Montgomery even more, and they tried to lay siege during the winter. Not exactly the best time to do so, but they do. And this is what happens. So Montgomery attacks early. So the actual full-on attack, because on the 8th they don't have enough artillery to breach the defenses of Quebec City. So they actually have to attack by foot. December 31st. It's very cold out. It is smack dab in the middle of the winter. It's actually past the winter solstice, winter equinox. Yes. And so what happens is they come into Quebec City. Montgomery attacks early. He attacks to the south, and he actually gets near into the city walls and is killed, basically. And now I'm going to go back just a little bit. When I was talking about the French and Indian War, I thought there was someone else that died, and I couldn't find any record of it. And I told you about that. That's because I had actually confused between 1754, I think, when they first attacked, and 1775. Montgomery comes in, tries to attack from the south, and is actually killed. The troops that he's with actually get captured as well. Arnold has another assault, but he's shot. He comes from the north of Quebec, so he comes up above. And remember, this is the plains of Abraham. He comes from the north, comes into Quebec, and is shot in the leg, and is wounded so much that Daniel Morgan has to take over. Well, the sad thing is, Quebec was actually well fortified and had a lot of troops at the time, because probably they didn't believe that they'd take over Montreal, that they'd go after Montreal, that they'd come to Quebec City first, probably by St. Lawrence River, going down into Quebec City. Remember, this is the St. Lawrence River, coming down into Quebec City. But no, they went to Montreal first, and then to Quebec City. And by doing that, they were tired. It was December. It was freaking cold. Holy cow. And because of that, Daniel Morgan and all the troops were basically captured. That's right. They failed pretty bad. So the Continental Army continues to lay siege on Quebec for a time between January and May of 1776, but suffer from the harsh winter conditions, disease like smallpox, and the lack of supplies. It made it so that they actually had to retreat. So British reinforcements actually arrived, coming from the river, arrived in Quebec by, they were led by General Guy Carleton. And he broke the siege, and by May 11th, the American forces basically had to retreat and end their invasion in Canada. Now remember, they did have Montreal, but they had to leave, so they came back to Montreal. Some of them came back down south, and so forth. By June 1776, the British pursued the retreating Americans, driving them all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga, outside of Montreal, out of Fort St. Jean, and back to Fort Ticonderoga. That was one of the first major failures of the American Revolution on the American side. Now, they did make some good headway when they got to the fort and then up to Montreal, but they could not take Quebec City. And that was one of the biggest things they had to do. So some of the impacts. What were some of the impacts? First off, failed invasion into Canada. It weakened American morale and the resources. So the Continental Army was a little, their morale was down, but it did not deter their determination. British remained in control of Quebec and used that base for future operations into the American colonies. The American colonists knew this. They knew that they had to take Quebec City. That's why they stayed till May. So November till May, continuing to try to attack, even though a lot of their troops were already captured and taken prisoner inside of Quebec. They knew that if they did not take Quebec City, that would be a staging ground for the British to come down into the colonies and take over the colonies. But they failed at it. So the British retained the control of Quebec. They later controlled Montreal, and the French Canadians, which the colonists thought would actually side with them, basically remained neutral. Remember, I'm not saying the British Canadians. I'm saying the French Canadians, those that did not like the British in their land, but they stayed neutral or loyal to the British Crown because the Americans could not show up. I think that's actually why they took Montreal quite quickly, is because the French Canadians, they actually weren't that sad about the British being kicked out if they had that chance. So they basically rejected the alliance with the Americas at that point. So that was one of the long-term failures of that campaign. Now let's go into what was happening with others that were happening. So you have those that came up north from Boston when Boston was finally, the siege finally happened and took over. Remember, that was around April 1776. The British forces evacuated. They left Boston and came up here to Nova Scotia. And they came up here because that was another staging ground for the British. Now, the colonists, George Washington, begins fortifying New York and the surrounding areas, including Manhattan Island and Long Island. So this is one thing that's really interesting. My ancestors were actually from Long Island. They were actually there during the American Revolution. I don't know any history about them. Now I'm really wondering about them. They were actually whalers during the time. They came over with the Mayflower and then found their way down to Long Island and became potato farmers and whalers down in the East Hamptons, in this area right here. East Hampton, Montauk, Sag Harbor. Oh, yeah, I remember all those places. You know, it's interesting because a long time ago they started moving out, and the Edwards have like one piece of land that's probably like an acre and a half. And it actually, it has my dad's dream in there, which is a aquaculture farm. Aquaculture is basically where you raise fish. Again, we were whalers, fishermen, potato farmers. We're not like the people that are there right now, the Hamptons. You've heard of them, the multi-million-dollar homes and everything. We don't own that land. We own one fish farm. And that's because my dad's dream as a fisherman in the bay at Long Island, down here. So he fished in this bay right here. And I actually fished with him. And over here, Gardiner's Bay, Gardiner's Island, come out here. He'd fuel up here in Connecticut. So my dad was actually, and in here, Sag Harbor. He was all about the environment. He wasn't a greenie. He wasn't an extremist of any sorts. He was a fisherman. He believed in the environment more than most environmental activists do, because he wanted the fish to be there for generations. And I'll tell you one story. There is I can't remember exactly the fish. I think it was the sea bass. Was put on the endangered species list. Because it was put on the endangered species list, its numbers went from very small because it was overfished to extreme, and they wouldn't take it off the endangered species list. Well, the bad thing about the sea bass is they'd eat up everything else. If you had young halibut, they'd eat them. If they had lobsters, they'd eat them. If they had small fish, they'd eat them. They did everything, and they were destroying that area. So my dad's dream was actually and he did a lot of legislation with those in New York and the East Coast, trying to get this changed. And finally it was changed after a long time. But he was able to fight for that in that area. And actually, one thing that's interesting, Gardiner's Island right here, supposedly there's pirates' treasure there. But there's been so many pirate treasure hunters that have searched this island out that basically those that own the island, they own the whole island. The whole island is theirs. Those that own that island, and small parts being different people, but the majority of it, they basically said no more hunters. No more treasure hunters, not allowed. And so that's all stopped. So that's just an interesting little bit. But we were in this area. Now, coming back to the story of the American Revolution, so George Washington solidified fortifications all around New York because he knew the British were coming for New York next. Now, they hadn't arrived, but in April 1776, George Washington was fortifying it because he knew that was going to be an objective of the British. So what happened? June 1776, 2 months later, the British fleets with General William Howe. Again, who was William Howe? William Howe, and also his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, they begin amassing forces off Staten Island. But first, he's the one that left Boston and came up to Nova Scotia in order to regroup and then he sent his forces down. George Washington knew exactly what he was doing. But he went to Staten Island. He started staging all of his troops in Staten Island. So, Staten Island, New York. So the British came in and started putting all of their forces in Staten Island. So at this point, Washington moves his troops to defend New York, numbering around 19,000 poorly trained soldiers. So they were not well-trained soldiers. Those in Staten Island, those the British were. The British forces began on Long Island, actually. So they actually prepared their attack coming from Long Island. I'm actually not quite sure what part. I should actually look more into that. You can too. But this is August 22nd. The British force start. So Washington and his forces are stationed in Brooklyn Heights. So let's go to Brooklyn Heights. This is, again, Staten Island right there. Brooklyn Heights. Let's type that in. Brooklyn. Yes, Brooklyn. Brooklyn Heights. There we go. In Brooklyn, New York. Wait a second. Okay, yeah, Brooklyn Heights. Up here. So the Washington put his forces right here, trying to make sure that they couldn't get in. Now, some of these islands over here were actually, when you... Do you know the Statue of Liberty? Okay? Everyone knows the Statue of Liberty. Most people know about Statue of Liberty. Do you know what it sits on? It sits on a fort. Actually, I think it's a... not the entire old fort that was there, but it sits on the fort that was underneath. So if you look at the Statue of Liberty, I'll show you a picture of it. Maybe, there we go. The Statue of Liberty. You can't exactly see it very well, but this down here is the fort. The statue was actually built on top of the fort. There's a big story about that. We'll get into it when we talk about the building of the Statue of Liberty. But the fort is there to actually keep that area safe. Some of these other islands also have forts on them as well. Now, you have, again, Staten Island, British, Brooklyn, American. These islands, different forts. So the British attack August 22. Well, sorry. See, the forces begin landing in New York in September 22nd, but I think it was August 22nd. I think it's August 27th when the British finally start to utilize their flank maneuvers and start attacking the colonists that are right here. So they jump islands from Staten Island onto Long Island and then come up through Brooklyn into Brooklyn Heights. They're trying to get closer to New York. Again, New York used to be the headquarters of the U.S. government. Well, okay, sorry. Yeah, after the American Revolution. It will be a place where they actually situate the first or second, I think it's the second location for the federal government before Washington, D.C. You have Philadelphia, then New York, and then down to Washington, D.C. Because Philadelphia was the #1 center. That was the center of all this, everything that was being strengthened, the colonies and such during this time. New York was basically like the economic center. So this economy coming out of New York was very valuable, very strategic in placement, and so the British really wanted this. So they came up through Brooklyn and attacked and won. Then, August 29th through the 30th, Washington executes a miraculous nighttime evacuation of his troops. They actually cross the river into New York, trying to get away from the British, because the British are coming at them. And now, usually at night, everything stops. Why? Because you can't see a thing. If you're attacking somebody else, you're going to probably hurt your own people. So, August 29th through the 30th, so that night, Washington gets all of his troops across the river to avoid being captured. What's great about this is, again, the river is a barrier to the British. Now, it's a natural boundary, a natural border, but it's not uncrossable. So by September 15th, the British come in and take over New York City as well. So with little resistance, Washington is basically withdrawing all of his troops, bringing them up to Harlem Heights. Harlem is up here. So they're moving up. Washington's moving up. He's trying to get away. He's trying to regroup. Yeah, they're losing quite dramatically. So the Battle of Harlem Heights occurs with Washington's forces successfully repelling the British advancement. So it's a morale booster, but it only takes a little bit of time. So there's another place. It's called the White Plains. I'm going to type this in. White Plains. Whoop, there you go. White Plains, New York. So coming from there up to here. So they are on the move. They're on the run. The colonists are no match to the large numbers and well-trained numbers of British soldiers. So they continue to move up and come up to White Plains. And this is where a large battle occurs. It's October 12th to the 18th. Howe's troops, his army, moves north to outflank Washington. So this actually doesn't last very long. Well, it lasted 6 days. But still, the colonists could not regroup. They didn't have the people, and so they had to leave again. The Battle of White Plains takes place, the major one, the very end of it, happens on October 28th. The Battle of White Plains, the official battle, takes place. British forces defeat the Americans, compelling Washington again to retreat. He leaves. Washington withdraws his army to the west, though. So, over here, this is the Hudson River. So the Hudson River, Washington comes out of the White Plains after the battle and is retreating. So he moves straight west and crosses over into New Jersey. So New York, New Jersey. Well, I guess still New York, but he comes down into New Jersey. Because where's the next place he's going? General Howe is maniacal. He is so determined to get Washington because Washington is the commander-in-chief of basically the whole Continental Army and the whole resistance. If Howe can capture Washington, he basically has everything. Washington knows this. He knows he's more than just a commanding officer. He is a figurehead. He has to keep safe. He has to stay away from the British. So what does he do? He escapes again. This time he goes into New Jersey. This one is still not done. We are not done. The Battle of Fort Washington. Now, this one is going to be different. I'm going to break from this story of George Washington, and we're going to do it down to the Fort Washington. Okay, two different things, completely different. So let's go back down to Washington. Remember this area. The White Plains. Okay. Back down, there is another group. Actually, there's a few different groups in this area with about 3,000 American troops. That's right. They are in Manhattan. Okay, actually, you know what? Went to Manhattan is, I'm looking for a boundary. Okay, so yeah, that whole part, whole island part. Now, but that's not the one I want to look at. I want to actually go to Fort Washington and check out where this is. Whoops. No, Fort Washington. Where's the actual fort? That's not the fort I'm looking for. Fort Washington. It's on Manhattan Island, so what am I saying? Let's see. Fort Washington. Try this one. Nope, now we're just getting further and further away. Okay, let's go back up. Over. Okay, come back to New York. Not working. Okay, Fort Washington is down here. There we go. It's... I was trying to type it in because I don't know the exact location of Fort Washington. But it is at the bottom of Manhattan. Now, here's the question. Is it fully intact now? I just visited there. I can't remember. I've forgotten so many different things There's so much information in this head that I'm trying to figure out, or trying to keep it all straight. I'm not a historian by nature. I did not go through the training of it, of going through college. I've learned it from actually reading sources and editing curriculum. So it's more than a history teacher, but not quite someone that's basically developed their whole life around history. So going into here, there's Fort Washington. The British launch an assault November 16th into Fort Washington on Manhattan and capture it along with 3,000 American troops. Washington continues to leave New York and go into New Jersey because he knows there's no way he's going to be able to win. He also, again, like I said, he's a figurehead. He knows he has to get out. So he retreats into New Jersey. November 21st, Washington and the Continental Army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Pursued by the British, Howe is still after him. December 1st through the 24th, the Continental Army, dwindling in size and morale, camps in Pennsylvania. British forces occupy Trenton. Now, this is the part that we need to check out. Okay, Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, so the British come over. Now again, remember, where are we? So the White Plains are up here, and Pennsylvania is right here. Where's the boundary? There it is. Okay. So Trenton is right on the border. Washington has come in over here into Pennsylvania. Now there are a lot more British troops. Look how close they are. Trenton, Washington is about this area. Philadelphia. Yikes. That's a very dangerous area because remember the Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. So what do they have to do? They cross over the Delaware River. Okay. Delaware River. That's the Delaware River right here. So they cross over. Trenton's here. They cross over the Delaware River and they keep moving south. That's Washington and the Continental Army. Again, zoom out just a little bit. New York, White Plains, Trenton, and Pennsylvania. So during this time, Washington is getting a little nervous because, again, this is the turning point. Just like, remember, Quebec City was the turning point where if the colonists had taken over Quebec City, they would have a lot more strength when it comes to the north against the British. They weren't able to do it. The same thing happens if all of a sudden Washington is captured. December 25th. What's that? Oh yeah, that's right. Christmas. Washington and his armies famously cross the icy Delaware River. Oh, wait a second. You've heard this story before, right? You've seen the picture. Yeah, that's right. So Washington crosses over the Delaware River again and comes in. Washington knows he has to take over, has to fight the British. They're losing morale. They're losing people. So December 26th, crossover 25th. Now it's the 26th. It's the day after Christmas. The British probably didn't think that they would attack the day after Christmas. The Continental Army surprises the Hessian garrison in Trenton. Those are the people that are left there to safeguard the area. I think by this time, they know they can't go any further. And they achieve a decisive victory. A victory that boosts American morale, reinvigorates the revolutionary cause. Washington has his win. He needs this win. He gets it. By January 2nd, 7 days later, Washington defeats the British reinforcements in the Second Battle of Trenton and takes over Trenton. So he's finally starting to take back some of the losses. January 3rd, Washington wins another victory in the Battle of Princeton. Okay, so let's go with Princeton. Where is Princeton? Princeton, New Jersey. There's Trenton. And then moving up higher comes into Princeton. So this area. So because of this, he's able to get more strength behind him. It's not just that. That is not the most important thing to Washington. He is losing troops hand over fist. Remember last week I told you, the troops only sign under a 1-year contract. After 1 year, they get to decide, am I going to stay with the Continental Army or am I going to leave? Well, because he was able to push for this, the very end, like again, December 26th, January 1st, they have to either renew or go home. January 26th, he takes over Trenton. He gets more morale. They're still in the fight. So what are the people going to do? Wait a second. We just won a battle. Let's keep going. January 2nd, they go in, win the second battle of Trenton. So the people are still invigorated. They're still going. By the 3rd, they're taking over Princeton for the next attack. And because of that, this continues the momentum forward. Remember, though, they just lost New York. New York is a big blow to the Continental Army. New York was, again, the economic center of the colonies. And now it's gone. The British have it, and they have reinforced it. So they're not getting that back anytime soon. So they're staging everything on Long Island, New York Island, all those islands to stay solidified in that area. The colonists know that they do not have the troops and everything they need to take it back over. Remember, this is January 2nd, 1777, and actually January 3rd, 1777. So there you go. That is the campaign on New York. It's a very important one, but it's you basically have to get Canada and New York at the same time, because after this, it really turns to winter. I mean, of course, crossing the Delaware River, Christmas night was quite a feat, but it gets worse over time. So I'm going to leave that for Wednesday. Thanks so much for joining us on this Adventure Box podcast day, and we will talk to you next time. Take care, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.